Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. So welcome everyone. Thanks for attending today, and thanks for joining this Adam Matthew webinar. Today we're going to be exploring the 2020 collections, so all of the frontlist collections that are publishing this year, some of which are already published and some of which are forthcoming this year. So my name's Alex Butler. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager here at Adam Matthew. And I'm going to be moderating today's session. So we're going to go through a bit of housekeeping and then we'll get into each of the collections. So today we'll be hearing from 6 of our editors who've been working on these projects for the last few years, are going to be taking us through what each of these primary source collections are and a few highlights about each of the collections as well. Just a bit of housekeeping for the webinar. If you could keep yourself muted at all times, just so that we can have a clean recording and everyone can concentrate, that would be fantastic. This webinar is being recorded, so if you have colleagues who couldn't make it, we'll be sending that recording around, so please feel free to share that recording with them. Lastly, if you do have questions throughout the webinar, there is a chat box for those of you that maybe haven't used Microsoft Teams before. Just write hello in the chat now, so hopefully you'll be able to see that. If you have any questions for any of our speakers throughout, please feel free to put those in there, and we'll get to those at the end. If you have any technical issues, I do have a few colleagues on hand who can maybe troubleshoot with you in the chat as well if you're struggling to hear. So that's the housekeeping. I am going to just move to the next slide, and I'll hand over to our first speaker today, who's Natalie Dale.
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everyone. My name's Natalie, and I'm an assistant editor in production at Adam Matthew. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the first module of FO Southeast Asia, published in February this year. So this collection came about in response to discussions with librarians who felt there was a real lack of digital resource material on Southeast Asia in the modern period. So we've included file classes from across the Foreign Office and Commonwealth Relations Office, which gives us a really comprehensive coverage of events from the perspective of the Foreign Office, but also a sense of the reaction within Southeast Asia itself. All material comes from the National Archives UK, and it adds over 1,000 documents to our Archives Direct collections. And this first module looks at Southeast Asia in the 1960s with a particular focus on Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. And this is a real period of transformation in Southeast Asia, covering the end of the Malayan emergency, the creation of Malaysia in 1963, and the impact that had in the wider region, attempted coups and guerrilla activity, censorship and propaganda in the media, and the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation. There are also concerns surrounding the growing threat of communist activity and developing trade relations as well. A document which I always come back to explores the reaction in Indonesia to the creation of Malaysia. So President Sukarno of Indonesia opposed the formation of Malaysia and British involvement in this decision. And there's a growing sense of unease in this material, the escalating demonstrations in Indonesia and the safety of British workers in that area. This accounts from a British official in Indonesia who describes a demonstration at the embassy building, saying that the flag was cut down, ripped to ribbons, and the Indonesian flag hoisted in its stead amidst screams of delight from the crowd. He says that he marches to confront the police and says that he won't tolerate this mob nonsense any longer, and they want increased protection. And the document also examines the demonstration at the British Embassy in Jakarta. So there are telegrams being written as the building's literally on fire, and apologies following those at late responses because they've lost original documentation of the fire as well. And I find this really fascinating, firstly for the level of detail in this document at these events, but also as these include first-hand accounts, there's a more personal delivery of the history. So you get a sense of the fears of people living through this and the challenges that they faced at the time as well. Another document that I'd like to draw your attention to focuses on the attempted coup of President Sukarno in 1963. This material deals with the aftermath of this event, and there are lists of victims and suspects and speculation on the impact this will have in the region and how they'll move forwards from this. And this is a really crucial moment in Indonesian history and the beginning of Sukarno's withdrawal from power. And it's described here as having a catalytic effect on Indonesian politics, which is explored further in our video with Dr. Jim Corcoran of Hawaii Pacific University, and it's just a great contextual overview of the effects of this event on Indonesian politics. Academics specialising in this research area will be able to search by archival reference or browse the documents list to look at material in more detail. We also have lots of tools and features for undergraduate students exploring the resource. So as mentioned already, a great starting point could be the video included on the attempt at the coup of Sukarno, or the essay written by Professor Matthew Jones at the London School of Economics, which focuses on the creation of Malaysia. And these have links out to related content, which allows students to take a closer look at primary source material around the topic. We've added to our Archives Direct chronology, exploring key events in the 1960s in the region, and we've added to our interactive map as well, which is a great entry point into the documents if you want to focus on a particular country in your research. We've also compiled extensive lists of popular search terms on people, places, and topics. So if there's a particular area you want to focus on, researchers can click on these terms and they'll be directed to a list of any documents where that term appears in the text. So that's a really brief overview of the first module for this resource. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing any questions at the end, and I will hand over to Amy.
Thank you, Natalie. Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Amy and I'm the production lead for Poverty, Philanthropy and Social Conditions in Victorian Britain, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of this resource today. So this resource introduces users to the interactions between government policy and public philanthropy in 19th and early 20th century society, demonstrating shifts in welfare reform and also the social tensions surrounding poverty and public welfare. This collection essentially offers a multifaceted insight into the practices and discourses of Victorian bureaucrats, philanthropists and social reformers who aim to provide relief and support and an improved quality of life to the poor and marginalised communities of Britain. In line with this, one of the resource's editorial board members, Professor Seth Coven, beautifully describes the collection as offering a rich, multidimensional portrait of poverty in Victorian Britain. It wonderfully captures the intensity, breadth, creativity, heterogeneity, and passions of those engaged in grappling with poverty. So this multidimensional portrait has been created through 3 collections included in the resource. From the National Archives, we have digitised the correspondence and papers of assistant poor law commissioners and inspectors of the Poor Law Commission, Poor Law Board and Local Government Board. So these date from 1834, when the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed, through to 1904, and they document the difficult systematisation and administration of the new poor law across England and Wales. They include details of visits to designated poor law unions and workhouses, evaluations of workhouse conditions, and records of statistics on those receiving indoor or outdoor relief. From the British Library, we have a selection of periodicals and reports produced by a number of settlement houses, mostly based in London, in the late 19th and early 20th century. So university students and scholars would volunteer to live and work in settlement houses to provide education, culture, healthcare and recreational activities to the poor and marginalised communities in London's most deprived areas. So they were ultimately working to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. The periodicals that we have digitised from Toynbee Hall, the Bermondsey Settlement, Cambridge House and Oxford House, amongst others, document these efforts. From the Welfare Association Library Collection, which is housed at Senate House Library, we have digitised a vast number of pamphlets, reports and printed books covering topics such as poor relief, education, foster care, public health, cooperative societies, socialism, trade unions and disability. These documents present the voices of key social, political and economic reformers and philanthropists such as Helen Bosanquet, Thomas Malthus, Edwin Chadwick, Louisa Twining, Charles Booth and Keir Hardie, to name a few. The Family Welfare Association, which was known as the Charity Organisation Society from 1869 to 1946, documented its own work as well as collecting material relating to poverty, welfare and social reform. The charity still exists today in its current form as Family Action. So some of the key themes covered across these 3 collections include the poor laws, workhouses and outdoor relief, sanitation, slums and housing, charitable organisations and friendly societies, manufacturing, technology and trade, social reform and welfare, education and children, race and immigration, health, medicine and disability, social order and discipline, and socialism and political movements. The resource has been produced with undergraduate students in mind, as well as researchers, and we've aimed to make this fantastic material as accessible as possible. Handwritten text recognition search technology has been applied to the correspondence and papers of poor law assistant commissioners and inspectors, digitised from the National Archives. Also included in the resource are some brilliant, unique essays and case studies written by members of our editorial board. So the essays offer some fascinating explorations of themes and documents in the resource, whilst the case studies are brilliant introductions to some of the key themes and topics of the material. We've also organised all of the documents included in this resource into thematic groups to help make them as discoverable as possible. And an interactive chronology sits the material in its broader historical context, covering legislation and reforms, political events and prime ministers, philanthropic movements, and general history as well. So more details, including a full contents list for the resource, can be found on the Adam Matthew website. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm now pleased to introduce my colleague Lindsay Gulliver.
Thank you very much, Amy. Hello all, I'm Lindsay and I was the project lead for 19th century, I was the project lead for 19th Century Literary Society, the John Murray Publishing Archive, which was released at the beginning of April. So held by the National Library of Scotland since 2006 and added to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register in 2011, the John Murray collection comprises one of the world's most important literary archives. Throughout the 19th century, the Murray family published blockbuster titles including Emma, On the Origin of Species, Missionary Travels, and the epic poem Don Juan. Materials span the entirety of the long 19th century and document the golden era of the House of Murray from its inception in 1768, focusing predominantly on the tenure of John Murray II and his son, John Murray III, as they rose to prominence in the publishing trade. The Murrays worked with some of the best-known authors of the 19th century, including Jane Austen, Charles Darwin, David Livingstone, and Sir Walter Scott. They published novelists and poets, but also works by politicians and scientists, explorers. Consequently, this collection covers an array of themes in addition to literary history and business. These include the sciences, politics, society, travel, and the world. The John Murray Archive also houses the most complete archival collection of their most famous author, the poet Lord Byron. So his manuscripts and personal papers, I would say, are a particular highlight of this new collection, and they chart both literary triumph and personal scandal. The Byron Papers make up around 15% of this collection, and highlights include annotated proofs of his works by his friends, including Mary Shelley, personal correspondence, which tracks his very colourful private life, and related works that comment on his tragic death and also the burning of his memoirs. Primary sources digitised in 19th Century Literary Society include financial ledgers, manuscript drafts, printed proofs, and correspondence. Experienced scholars of literary history have a treasure trove at their fingertips here. The unparalleled John Murray collection allows for in-depth research into the everyday workings of a successful 19th century publishing house. Now, several digital and contextual tools will make these materials more accessible for newcomers. For the first time, the manuscript material will be searchable using handwritten text recognition, making more than 200,000 pages easily navigable. Filmed at the Murrays' historic home on Albemarle Street, the video introduction lays out the main themes, stories, and players of 19th century literary society, in the very same parlour where the memoirs of Lord Byron were actually burned. Biographies on the key figures in this collection help students make connection and help them find relevant documents, while an interactive chronology provides vital context to the events of 19th century society. An exhibition on the life cycle of the book charts the evolution of 5 different titles published by the Murrays and demonstrates how a student of book history can use this new collection to track publication using different document types. For example, a proposal, a draft, or even the sales figures. There are so many incredible tales to discover within the John Murray archive, but one in particular really illustrates the role a publisher plays in making history. In 1859, after 20 years of work, the noted scientist Charles Darwin approached John Murray III to publish his theory of evolution, a draft that would eventually become On the Origin of Species. Murray, who was a passionate fan of the sciences, was really eager to publish the work and sent the first draft to his trusted advisor, Whitwell Elwin. However, Elwin was horrified by the work, reporting that it seemed rushed, that it lacked evidence, that its publication would only embarrass the great scientist. In his words, "It is to ask the jury for a verdict without putting the witness into the box." Instead, what Elwin suggested was a much shorter work which would apply Darwin's theory specifically to pigeons, because, to quote Elwin, "everybody is interested in pigeons." Murray fought tirelessly to bring On the Origin of Species to publication as we know it today, and the impact that work had is impossible to calculate now. After all, would On the Origin of Pigeons have had quite the same legacy? It seems unlikely. So this is just one of the brilliant stories you'll discover in 19th century literary society. From book history to travel writing, politics to poetry, this newly digitized resource introduces an unparalleled repository for 19th century culture and for the literary luminaries who shaped it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Felix, and I am looking after the Early Modern England project, which is next Wednesday. Early Modern England's culture and society, it offers some amazing, rare and invaluable sources for examining the lived experience of people who witnessed this pivotal era of English history. So the collections here, they are looking at the lives of ordinary people and some more prominent families and individuals. So a great cross-section of society, and that's rather than the great events of the time. Just quickly, the material comes from 7 different libraries and archives, and you can see them listed in front of you there. So it really is a fascinating project for seeing how people experienced the start of what we call the modern era. And that's really the changing economic, intellectual, religious and political landscape. And this change during this 200-year period, which is covered by this project, is for me wonderfully exemplified by this document you can see in the collection. And this is an essay by the philosopher John Locke. It's concerning toleration from 1667. And of course, this 1667 comes towards the end of the period that this project covers, which is 1700. And you wonder, to me, it poses the question, well, why are you talking about toleration now? And of course, part of the answer to this is that England has just experienced a civil war between the king and parliament. And prior to that, there had been a religious schism in terms of the Reformation. And so these events really exemplify the upheaval and the change of this time. And through this, we really aim to look at the experiences of the people who lived this time. And so how do we examine those experiences? This project publishes various different types of source, so from administrative records, legal records, commonplace books, wills, inventories, annotated printed books, correspondence, and more. You can see several examples of this, and I can talk you through how they're used by historians. So on the right of the screen is a court record from the Canterbury Quarter Session Papers. And these are records that are invaluable for social historians who are interested in the lives of ordinary people. So of course, the so-called ordinary people their written records rarely survive today, whether that's because they're lost or literacy wasn't so high as it is now. But what you can do is glimpse their lives through the witness statements found in such court records. And that's often while they're giving their depositions, and they will describe the world in which they live. And of course, there are other ways of getting at the lives of ordinary people, and also in this collection are sets of wills and inventories, which really shed light on what people possessed and how they lived in that way. The middle item you see on your screen is a diary. In this case, it's of a minor nobleman called Arthur Throckmorton. And of course, diaries are great records for recording the experiences of the everyday in certain classes. And of course, we also have volumes of correspondence from more prominent families, which again give that sense of experience. And then finally, my final example on the left is a printed book which has annotations. And this is, again, a really interesting source for seeing how people interacted with these texts. So obviously the text survives, but how can you possibly know what someone thought of this text or how they understood it? And so these annotations are invaluable for that. And then finally, I would just like to mention a couple of other features of the resource. And one, similar to what you've just heard, there is handwritten text technology in this collection, which is fantastic for finding words in manuscript. And finally, there is a strong material culture element in this collection. We have hundreds of objects photographed, and they're objects from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and material culture is from Birmingham University, and she's recorded a great video for us demonstrating how you should study material culture. So that's a summary of what you'll find in early modern England, society, culture, and everyday life. So should be a crucial resource for examining the lived experience of this and how some of those greater historical forces that we call modern may or may not have shaped life. So thank you very much, and on to my colleague Nick.
So yes, my name is Nick, and I've spent the past couple of years looking after our digitisation of the Mass Observation Project, which was launched in 1981 by the University of Sussex as a rebirth of the original mass observation from the 30s, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and which Adam Matthew have also digitised. And the aim was the same. It was to document the social history of Britain by recruiting volunteers to write about their lives, about society, and about current events. And what you can see in front of you is one of the directives, so-called essentially a questionnaire, a very open-ended questionnaire from Mass Observation, which is about the general election of 1987. And our new resource, which is launching next month, consists of all of these directives from the 1980s and the hundreds of responses to each of them by hundreds of mass observers, so-called, which adds up to about 18,000 responses in total. And the directives and responses from the 90s and 2000s, 2001 to 2009, that is, are going to be added over the next couple of years. So what's in the directives? They're very, very broad in their scope. Generally, a directive will cover either a current event or a social trend of some kind, or an aspect of personal life and behavior, or in some cases, all three. What you can see in front of you now are some of the responses from the to the directive I showed you a moment ago, the 87 General Election Directive. And there are, as well as that, there are current events directives in the 80s on the royal wedding of Charles and Diana. There's one on the Falklands War of 1982, and the government's AIDS awareness campaign of 1987. There are social trends directives on electronic banking and the rise of the Liberal SDP alliance in politics, which challenged Conservative and Labour. And there are personal life, personal behaviour directives on friends and neighbours, waste, thrift and consumerism, and regular pastimes. So it really does cover the gamut of life in terms of what people are thinking, what they're doing, what's happening to them in the external world, and so on and so on. So in terms of people who will benefit from this collection, I think it's fair to say that all university level researchers will find something for them in this, if they're interested in British social history. There's no real parallel to the Massob collection in the English-speaking world that I think any of us are aware of. So the material itself is the fundamental draw, of course. But we've made the site, as far as we can, accessible for all categories of researcher. So the directives themselves and the responses, which are typed or printed, which is about a third of them in the 1980s material, they're full text searchable in the entire site. You can see here I've done a search for Bristol and got about 137 responses which mention Bristol in their full text. And there's also, if you look at the bottom right hand corner, there's a pop-up for Adam Matthew Explorer, which has also found several hundred results in the original mass observation, which is cross-searchable with this resource. But we have also implemented, as many of my colleagues have already mentioned, handwritten text recognition in the handwritten responses, which are about 2/3 in the 1980s. You can see here I've done a search for royalty, which is highlighted in the text. So that obviously increases discoverability of manuscript responses hugely. So together that browsability, or searchability rather, is maximized using those two processes. We've also added a number of filters to the documents, which use metadata information about the observers. So the observers are anonymous; they're only referred to using an alphanumeric code. But we know things about them. We know their age, their sex, the region of the country they live in, often their employment sector, their marital status. And we've added this information in as filters so that people can filter the directives according to the type of people that they're interested in. So together, I think that, as I say, that maximizes searchability, accessibility for everyone, but is particularly useful for undergraduates who might have fairly little experience often with primary sources, and complements the existing Adam Matthew mass observation resource, which we know is widely used by its purchasers in undergraduate teaching. And we've also added contextualizing essays and video essays by academic experts in the field on the content and also on uses of the material. It's worth highlighting, I think, the appeal of the resource outside history departments. So, for example, many observers contribute over years or even decades to mass observation. There are one or two, I think, who've contributed both to the original and to this. And all that, together with the recurrence of topics in the directives, makes the material of great use to, for example, sociologists who are performing longitudinal studies of social attitudes. So there is a lot in there for everyone. And I'll hand over now to Rachel, who is going to talk about children's literature.
Brilliant, thank you, Nick. Hi everyone, my name is Rachel and I'm a development editor here at Adam Matthew, and I'm going to tell you about our fabulous children's literature and culture resource, which is due to publish later this year. So as you can see by the incredible visuals of this image from Sleeping Beauty, children's literature and culture will be a resource of richly illustrated primary source literature content written for children spanning the 19th and early 20th century. The resource will contain over 8,000 individual documents sourced from 2 archives, the American Antiquarian Society and the Winterthur Library and Museum. Within those documents will be a broad spread of formats, everything from books and pamphlets to sheet music, toys and games, stereo photographs and original watercolour artworks. The resource will feature a range of genres of literature for children, from early forms of instructional and devotional primers through to illustrated rhymes, tales, stories, chapbooks, novels and picture books, and case studies of classic children's tales such as Robinson Crusoe, Sleeping Beauty and Robin Hood. Material cover themes such as gender roles in the family, perceptions of race, illness and death, morality and behaviour, and education and religion. The materials in the resource will be useful to a wide range of researchers at all levels. Undergraduates are going to find the material as accessible as experienced researchers will find it rich. Researchers and students from a number of different disciplines will find the materials to support their work here. Social historians can discover the narratives and mores that have permeated culture to such an extent that children were introduced to them, such as gender roles, how to perceive communities of colour, and developing ideas about nationhood. Examples on this slide here include the disorderly girl, who's morally judged for her messy and noisy and unmodest ways, though she does look like she's having quite a lot of fun in that picture in the top right. Other examples include The Inky Boys by Heinrich Hoffmann, which is a morality tale which has been subject to multiple scholarly interpretations, and Yankee Doodle, an illustrated interpretation of the patriotic song. Historians of childhood can combine literature with the more ephemeral material culture of toys and games, such as the dissected map shown at the top there, sheet music and stereographs to help reconstruct 19th century childhood as a concept and an experience. Book historians will also be able to trace how technological advances revolutionised the printing industry and how children's books evolved as a result. For example, we've included some chromolithographic progressive books, which show how these images were built up using this labour-intensive technique. And that image in the bottom right is one of the very, very early stages of the first layers of chromolithography. Art, literature and animal historians will also find a rich seam of useful primary sources here. Apart from being a feast for the eyes, there are several aspects of the resource I would highlight as being particularly special or useful for researchers. The backbone of our selection from the American Antiquarian Society is the McLaughlin collection. The McLaughlin brothers were an influential and pioneering publishing house whose material is not available in such volumes anywhere else online. We've also included the McLaughlin Art Archive, which is a unique collection of draft illustrations, original paintings, drawings and proof books. To showcase this material, in the resource we will include an exhibition that will demonstrate the progression of key illustrations from draft to publication with academic commentary. By way of an example, you can see in the top left an original watercolour painting of Santa arriving at a lucky child's house, and on the right the painting appears as a chromolithographic illustration in the McLaughlin Bros version of 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. There are rare or first editions of influential children's books such as Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, and my personal childhood favourite What Katie Did by Susan Coolidge, which is why you can see the front cover there. We've selected a robust list of religious tracts and morality tales, including a case study of Hannah More, allowing researchers to investigate how religion interacted with the concept and childhood experience in the 19th century. We'll also include a video introduction to the American Antiquarian Society collections with curatorial staff, including Laura Wasowich, who is the hands-down expert on the materials and has provided crucial advice on the shape of the resource. We'll also make available an exhibition looking at the evolution of several key titles, exploring how they've been told, retold, translated, imitated, revised and expanded, and sometimes very cheekily copied without copyright permission. Robinson Crusoe is a great example. The bottom left shows an adaptation of the text written with words of just one syllable for early readers. And one final thing I'd recommend to look out for in the resource when it's published is annotations by the owners. You'll find several dedications and doodles throughout, providing a very charming direct link to those children's experience of using those materials. There's a great scribble from one child, or perhaps a parent, who's simply written "I love chocolate" into one book that I'm particularly fond of. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. So now we come to the section where we can take some questions and answers on any of our collections. So if you have any questions, please feel free to just put them in the chat and we can look at answering those. Okay, so I'll just leave it a few more seconds, but whilst we're doing that, I'll move on to the last slide. So if you'd like more information about any of the collections you've seen today, please either drop us an email at the email address you can see here, or if you just go on our website, which is amdigital.co.uk, you can find out much more information about any of the collections you've seen here, or if you think of a question maybe a little bit later on, please do get in touch with us either via that email address, or you can find us on Twitter as well. So I think we will leave the meeting there. Please do look out for the recording in your inboxes in the next few days. And just a big thank you for attending today. It was, hopefully you found it useful, and yeah, we'll be in touch soon. Thank you again.